Welcome to this third and final video of this Intro to Modular Synthesis series, Everything Else. In this video, we'll cover a wide variety of other staples of synthesis, including patch tips and techniques, from mults to sample and hold, to wave rectification, to ring modulation. Here's a quick look at all the things we'll cover in this video. And let's get started. So we saw briefly in the previous video while doing the Moog style patch that we had to split a cable from the envelope generator to our VCA and to our filter using a stackable cable. Now here I'll go a little bit more in depth of splitting your signal or using a mult, buffered mult, splitter, or stackable cable. First is the mult. Now this is just a passive mult with one input here and one input here, and three outputs for each of the multed signal. Now it is passive, so the signal reduces a little bit like flowing water through a hose. You're not going to get quite as much pressure the more outputs you use. Now there are buffered mults, which would be this with the power ribbon on the back to plug into the rack, which would keep the signal at the exact precise CV voltage in all the outputs, which is great if you need to mult to more than one oscillator for your volt per octave or something else that needs that added precision. And the next is the splitter, which kind of looks like a ninja star or other shapes, depending on what kind you get, and the stackable cable. Now these kind of work with the same principle of thinking about it like flowing water. If we plug from our output into the splitter, we now have 5 split outputs spraying water out of those 5 outputs. Now, if we plug another hose into this that's spraying water, we're going to get problems plugging an output into an output. But it doesn't matter where we plug this in because it's just like flowing water, and it's going to just come out and split signals to all these destinations. And again, this is passive, so it's going to draw a little bit from your signal the more you split it. And that is the same thing with a stackable cable. You need to go to 2 destinations or 3, plug your stackable cable in there, and then you plug your other output on top. And then at this destination, we also have another output of that mult. So we get 3 separate outputs from one output with a single stackable cable. Now, a lesser known thing with the stackables is it doesn't need to be plugged in at your source. Oftentimes I come into a problem where my stackable cable is not long enough, I can't reach. Well, I could plug in my first cable, and then at my destination, I plug the stackable cable in. And again, like flowing water, it's going through this green cable to that destination, but it's also flowing out this cable to this destination and this output. And that is mults and splitters and buffered mults. Now on to probably the first question I had to Google when getting into modular was, what the heck is an attenuator or attenuverter? And I had to look it up and found some long-winded description which kind of gave me a gist of what it is, but no one ever said it simply. It's just an amount knob for your input. That's all an attenuator is. You attenuate the signal or increase or decrease the amount. So to show this really quick in an application is I have a random gate coming out of steps going into the trigger at Baker here, and we can see it's firing an envelope. I'm going to plug that envelope into monocle here, which is just has a fancy name VC polarizer, but it's actually just an attenuverter. So right now at 12 o'clock, this input is nothing. And I'm going to plug this output into our oscilloscope so we can see what's going on. So I turn this amount all the way up, and we can see our envelope in the oscilloscope. Now basically I can control the volume, so to speak, of this envelope. And once we go left, it's going to go into the negative direction to invert our signal. And we can see it's flipped vertically over that horizontal center line. Now, a use for inverting would be if you want to use, say, an envelope like we're using now to turn a knob counterclockwise instead of clockwise. You need negative voltage. So, an attenuverter. And that, in a nutshell, is attenuating and attenuverting. Super easy. It's just an amount to your control voltage. Okay, now let's talk about pitch quantization, or quantizers. Say we want to use steps as a sequencer, which just sends out random voltage in positive and negative values. And we want to use that as our volt per octave tracking. It's not very musical. So we can plug that instead into a quantizer. So I'm going to plug this steps output into the input of this quad quantizer here. And then I'm going to plug that quantized output into the oscilloscope. So we can see here, it's taking that pitch voltage and rounding it to the nearest active note. And we could obviously change our scales or dial in custom notes. So it sets your active scale for whatever synthesizer you're using. Now you notice it is dropping into the negative range here, which is how steps works. So one way to combat that, if we want just positive range notes, because some quantizers can't handle the negative voltage, is we can offset it by plugging our steps into that attenuverter. But I'm going to go into the second input, and the first input just becomes offset voltage then. You'll see right here, it's just our offset voltage. So I plug into the second, we can offset where our steps are. So we can bring it into the positive range and attenuate our notes down so it's a wider or more narrow range. And that, in a nutshell, is quantization. Let's say we want to take this a step further and not worry about offsetting it, but we want to flip all those negative values positive. We need wave rectification. So I'm going to plug our steps output into this rectification 1U unit here. And our outputs are an inverted wave, half wave rectification, and full wave rectification, and you'll see what both of those are. Now this is half wave rectification, where it plays our notes, but anytime it goes into the negative, it just cuts it off at 0. So it just kind of cuts our wave off from the waist down, so to speak. Which is nice if you always want to be going back to that root note of your sequence. But for this, I want to take, say, everything negative and just flip it positive. That's full wave rectification. So we can see our waves are only going to be positive now because anytime it's in the negative space, it's going to be flipped inverted. And that is quantization and wave rectification. Okay, let's talk about Slew. Now, to perform Slew, you'll need a function generator. For this, we're going to use channel 1 of Carve. We could use any of the channels because each one is its own function generator, but we'll just use channel 1 for this one. So what I'm going to do is plug my volt per octave sequence into the input. I have the output volume all the way up, so it's giving us an unattenuated volt per octave signal. Now let's turn on rings here, and we can hear this random sequence going. Now what Slew does is we see in the oscilloscope, we have these direct jumps to those discrete values for the pitch. Now what Slew does is it kind of slows down that transition time of the rise and the fall, and we have control over each one independently. So you'll see here, when I turn the attack up, it's sliding upwards to the notes. But notice the release is down, so it's not sliding to the downward notes until I turn the release up. actually turn the attack down. And we could change the shape of the slew from exponential, which is going to be a faster curve to those notes, or logarithmic, which curves the opposite way of exponential, and logarithmic actually gives you the best portamento style slew to your notes. Now this could also be used on gates to make an attack release envelope generator, or any other signal that you want to kind of smooth out those jumps. And that, in a nutshell, is slew. Okay, now let's talk about sample and hold and track and hold. And again, to best demonstrate this, I'm going to use it as the volt per octave tracking for rings. Right now, I have just an LFO going into the quantizer and then going into rings. Now say we want to just pick specific notes for it to play that it passes at certain times. That's where sample and hold is going to come in. So I'm going to plug our output from this LFO into the input on SHTH, or sample and hold, track and hold. And I'm going to plug this output into our volt per octave that's going into the quantizer. Now we need one more thing, and that's a trigger to sample the note that is going in. So I'm going to just use random gates from steps here. So it's just going to randomly send gates to sample and hold and tell it when to sample the notes. So if I speed this up, we'll see it follows that LFO still, but just a little bit different. It's just sampling from every time it hits a trigger. It's going to stop at whatever value the input is at. Plug it in the pulse here for a little bit more regular triggers, and we can see how it's following the LFO a little bit better. And typically there is noise routed in, which is being sampled, but the noise is a little bit quiet. So you see here the noise is just giving us about 2 notes right now. So I put a higher voltage into the input to give us something a little better to work with. And if you want to see more about sample and hold and track and hold, you could check out my SHTH video on this page. Now let's talk about track and hold real quick, which is similar to sample and hold, except it's kind of the opposite. You'll see in just a second here. I'm going to plug this LFO input in again. And let's plug the output out. And we'll see it's doing nothing right now. Because it only stops like the sample and hold, anytime it hits a gate, it's always stopped. It's never like moving. Now the track and hold is always moving until it accepts a gate. When the gate is high, it's going to stop at whatever voltage it's at. So I'm going to use this random gate again instead of pulse triggers, because that won't work as well. And plug it into the track here. And you can see anytime it's getting a high gate, it is holding our note. And that in a nutshell is sample and hold and track and hold. Okay, really quickly, let's talk about subharmonic generators. Now I have this sawtooth wave going into Dirty Laundry and into the oscilloscope here. Dirty Laundry does a variety of wave folding and distortion, but it also has a subharmonic generator, which is the only thing we're going to use from this. So we see here, we have our saw wave, and this just takes the clock of the saw wave, so every peak and valley, and just divides it by 2. So we get an octave lower in pitch. And we can see that here because we have 1, 2, 3 spikes on the sub pulse, and we have 6 spikes on the sawtooth. And it just generates that from the waveform going in. So if you have a really strange or complex waveform, it's going to be a little bit more crazy, but it could do interesting effects. And we could get nice cross mixing here between our subwave and our sawtooth wave. Now this is helpful if you don't want to use another oscillator and you want everything to be still in that same exact frequency as your bass tone. And that is a subharmonic generator. So in the last video in this series, we looked at building a Moog style or East Coast or subtractive synth patch. Now that patch was very simple. It was just one oscillator into a filter into a VCA with an envelope generator applied to that VCA. But now I'll show how to build a more full Moog style patch with 3 oscillators and some noise. For this, I'm going to use the Coco series featuring Cascades and 2 Brooks, which are just smaller oscillators and a bigger, more complex oscillator. But we're going to use it for pretty simple means right now. To start, let's just tune the oscillator. I'm going to plug the pulse into our tuner here, and I'm going to tune it to C. And there we go. So for this fuller Moog style patch, I'm going to use sum and invert here, which I could use as a simple 3-channel mixer. For that, I'm going to plug a saw wave to start to channel 1 here. And let's take a listen to our mix coming out of the bottom one, because these 2 signals are normaled to this input here mixed with this one down here. So now I have that low bass tone, and now I want to get these 2 Brooks involved. So I'm going to plug a saw wave from the second oscillator here into sum and invert. And we could kind of detune as much as we want, or get it as close as we want in tune. Now, instead of just using 3 outputs from one oscillator, we're going to get slightly off phase waves if we use other oscillators as opposed to multiple outputs of the same to give us that more full sound, as you can hear coming right now. And let's pull a triangle wave from the last oscillator, and I'm going to plug that into B. But for this one, it's a little more soft of a waveform, so I'm going to tune it up to give us a higher pitch in there. And now I have 3 oscillators going into one output here. So now it's really nice with the Coco series here, as opposed to using 3 separate oscillators, is I only have to plug my volt per octave into the first one here. So if I play my sequence right now, we're only going to be hearing the first oscillator moving, and these 2 are staying still. But the way these are hooked up together, I could actually track all the oscillators to this 1 volt per octave. So it's going to route this volt per octave into that one and into that one. Now another thing that's useful for patching into a Moog style patch is noise, which I'm going to use SHTH here. And that's helpful for getting that more woodwindy, breathy, more realistic natural sound in with these raw waveforms. Now this mixer doesn't have attenuators, but if you do have a mixer with attenuators, it's much easier to dial in each oscillator and the noise to the exact volumes that you want. From this mixer output here, we would just route this into our filter, into our VCA with the envelope generator, and then we have a nice full Moog style patch. Now let's look at frequency modulation, which is similar to volt per octave tracking, except it usually involves another audio rate oscillator. Right now we're listening to the sine wave coming out of Cascades here, and I just have the pulse wave going into the clock input on my oscilloscope for better tracking. Now these modules do internally normal for frequency modulation, but for simplicity here and to see what's going on, I'm going to just plug the sine output here from Brooks into the FM input on Cascades, which would be exactly the same if I didn't patch it, but I think visualizing it helps. So what is frequency modulation? It's modulating our frequency. Right now I have just an LFO going into it, and we can see what it's doing in slower time. But it does really interesting things when we get to audio rate. You can see how it's really manipulating our waveform here. We can get really cool otherworldly effects when we turn up the amplitude of that modulator sine wave. And this is just 2 sine waves. You can see how it's building up lots of upper harmonics. Now we could also do what's called syncing the oscillators, where it's essentially we take the pulse output from one oscillator and plug it into the sync input on another. And that basically tells the oscillator to reset. So even if it's at an off frequency, it'll have a bass tone of your carrier frequency. Now again, for simplicity's sake, instead of just using Valley here to sync, I'm going to take our clock output or our pulse output from Cascades, and I'm going to plug it into the sync input here. You can see here it is sunk, and it does interesting effects here. Especially when we go higher frequencies. Versus a lower frequency, it's not going to do quite as much. So we can see again here with it unplugged, in the sync on. For the internal normaling, it's doing the same thing here. And then we could actually cross-modulate both of them and send this sine wave internally into this one here to cause cross-modulation. I'll turn the sync off again. You can really see how crazy this starts to go. So we can see there's lots of cool effects to be had with frequency modulation. So let's turn these off. And now let's talk about amplitude modulation. Now typically for amplitude modulation, you would just put 2 oscillators into a VCA. One in the in and one in the CV input. But Cascade actually has it built in here, which helps to show it a little bit simpler. So I'm going to plug our amplitude modulation output into the oscilloscope here. Now what amplitude modulation does is just open and close a VCA. Right now it is open and we don't have anything coming in. And again, there's internal routing going on. You can see we're getting our sine wave right now. And I'll show you what our modifier does, which is also a sine wave coming from oscillator 2 here, and it's going into the mod input. Now when I turn my AM knob up here, it's going to increase the amount of our modifier modifying our carrier. And this is best shown when I change this to an LFO. We can see it'll work just like a VCA opening and closing. And the more I open it, the more it's going to close our signal. Now, how is that different than just an envelope and a VCA? Well, it gets fun when we go into audio rates. We could get some awesome harmonics going. That can really spice up the waveform that we have and make it a bit more interesting. So especially if we say change the waveform to saw. Or square. And that is amplitude modulation. And the last thing we're going to talk about for this video is ring modulation. For this, we're going to use fuse, also known as warps, by Mutable Instruments. Now, ring modulation works similar to amplitude modulation, in which you take two oscillator sources and mix them together, but it goes through some diodes and things that cause some interesting sound effects. So for this, I'm going to stick with two sine waves again, and I'm going to go into input 1 and input 2. And we'll take this main output and put it into our oscilloscope. Now right now, we just have a mix or a crossfade of the two. There's one oscillator, and there's the other oscillator. Now ring modulation happens right here, and the two different ring mods represent different types of diodes and types of ring modulation due to the hardware in the circuit board. So I'm going to turn it to that, and we can see how it's kind of going crazy now. And we can see how we're getting interesting effects here. When I go to one or the other, you see one is just kind of a little bit more intense than the other one. But what's happening here is it's mixing, combining the two signals, and it outputs the sum and the difference of the mixes, subtracting the original frequencies. I know that's confusing and doesn't really make much sense, but we can see here that it's kind of acting similar to amplitude modulation, where it gives us those upper harmonics, but it has a little bit more of a raw edge to it. And you can hit really awesome sweet spots depending on how you tune that second oscillator. In contrast, let's hear how it sounds in comparison with an LFO. We can see how it's kind of doing amplitude modulation here, but it's a little bit different. It's kind of a little jumpier. Again, back to the audio. And that's ring modulation. Now I want to say congratulations to you, because you just graduated from total noob to intermediate who knows just enough to get in trouble. If you like the series, be sure to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time with the next video.